Hi everyone, I'm artist and science illustrator Mattias Lanas. In today's episode, I'll be painting a shriveled dried oak leaf inspired by one of Tony Foster's artworks from an ancient forest in the United Kingdom called Wistman's Wood. Wistman's Wood is located within Dartmoor National Park in Devon County in the southwest of the UK. It's one of only a few native high-altitude oak woodlands in the country, conserved as a national nature reserve. The site was nominated for the Exploring Beauty Watercolor Diaries from the Wild Journey by Tony Foster's luminary, John Hawkes, who's the former director of the UK environmental campaigning community, Friends of the Earth. Hawkes describes the wood as a place of profound mystery and quiet beauty, evoked by the unusual look of its ancient and gnarled oak trees growing amongst granitic boulders, everything swathed in thick green moss. Tony Foster visited Wistman's Wood in 2013 to paint this large format piece called Wistman's Wood Looking South-Southwest, complete with a painted assemblage of dried oak leaves as a souvenir element arranged like leaf litter on a forest floor. There is beauty in the details here: imperfect leaf forms, veins, thin shadows between overlapping leaves, holes and blemishes, the variations in yellows and browns and dull greens. For today's demonstration, I was inspired to paint a gnarled, dried oak leaf, accentuating the sort of natural imperfections we often see in nature. I've acquired this beautiful photo of an oak leaf from California as a reference. Notice the colors and how they change across the leaf surface, the way the veins separate, almost like tree branches, the leaf margins sometimes accentuated thread-like by the light. And of course, the bulbous magenta blobs protruding from the leaf. These are a type of structure called a gall, harmless growths induced on the leaf surface by tiny wasps. It's like there's a whole ecosystem of colors and textures present on this one leaf alone. Today's focus in painting this leaf is on light and shadow as opposed to just colors. I want to make my painted leaf appear as if it's coming right off of the page by emphasizing light and dark areas, and in particular the cast shadow underneath. I also want to focus on working with muted colors, browns, and demonstrate how surprisingly brilliantly one can paint with these. Finally, I want to focus on imperfections in the leaf, and on capitalizing on these to make my painted leaf more interesting and true to subject than any generic leaf. If you're following along with me as I paint, make sure to first watch my materials video. Then you'll be aware of the supplies you'll need today. I have a standard watercolor painting setup for this lesson, including watercolor paper, a sharpened pencil and an eraser, water, watercolor paints and assorted brushes, and paper towel. You'll also want an additional sharpened hard pencil, such as an F, H, 2H, etc. hardness lead, but in the worst case, a sharpened regular HB or number 2 pencil will suffice. Don't forget a printout or digital download of the oak leaf reference photo as well. Get your supplies together and begin with a careful sketch of the oak leaf and its shadow, and let's get started. So here's my drawing, my foundational sketch of my oak leaf, which you can see I've created larger than life, and I've actually traced this directly from the photograph. You're welcome to do that as well, especially for this exercise. And working at this scale will allow me to get in most of the detail that I'm looking for in this photograph. The galls, some of the larger veins, the crinkles in the leaf, the blemishes, etc. You can see that I've also delineated the leaf margin differently than I have the shadow. The shadow's a bit drawn lightly on purpose so that those pencil marks don't stand out as much in the final product, whereas the leaf edge I want to be very crisp, and especially in places where I see the leaf edge being particularly pronounced, such as in these divots here between leaf lobes. So once you've got a sketch like this, you can go larger. I wouldn't recommend going too much smaller. We can get started on the watercolor. Let's talk about browns for a second. So I mentioned I was going to focus on working with muted colors, browns and sort of grays, those colors that come by mixing lots of primary or brighter colors together that we often see in nature and that are definitely present in this leaf. So if I bring up a color wheel, we can do a quick recap of complementary colors and how to create more muted or subdued colors with those. So here in this color wheel, right, the colors that are opposite of each other across the wheel are the complementary colors. For example, the green and red, the orange and the blue, the yellow and the purple, and all those secondary colors as well. So if I mix colors that are somewhat opposite to each other on the color wheel, I'm going to end up with these yucky browns, which in this case is what I'm looking for. There are also some browns that come straight from your watercolor tubes or your watercolor half pans if you're using bought supplies, and you're definitely welcome to use those, but I encourage you to experiment a bit, creating your own browns and muted colors by using other colors, just so you can see what a rich variety there exists in your palette already without having to purchase additional browns. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do think it's worth some quick experimentation with my colors to create a rich assemblage of browns that we may then use in this leaf. So let's see, to start out, here I've got my raw umber, and let's just see what that looks like on its own. And this one is burnt sienna. Some lovely browns there. This one here is not really a brown, it's a red, it's Indian red, but it falls sort of in the brown category. Even something like my yellow ochre is a pretty muted yellow, right? So it's also kind of in the brown camp. So alone there you can see I've got some browns straight from the tube that I can use. But let's see if I mix some complementary colors as well. So let's try green and red. I'm going to go with my hooker's green, add some red to that, maybe some permanent rose. I don't want to put too much permanent rose on this. The red I find tends to overpower the green in this combination. Let's see that. Ooh, that's looking very dark. Let me try some more red. See what that looks like. So a bit more permanent rose. There's a pretty dark brown. Let's try the Viridian with permanent rose. So here's Viridian, just another green and red combination. Some more Viridian. I got way too much red in there for my liking. But interestingly, it makes kind of a purple. And I think that's because the Viridian is such a deep bluey green that it's sort of like mixing blue and red together. We're getting this purplish color. It's a pretty muted color. I wouldn't call it a brown, it's more of a black, but that could still be useful. Since this does kind of look like a violet, what if I mix some of that with yellow? So I could take some of this cadmium yellow and just add a bit of that. Ooh, way too much. Get this as yucky as I can and see what kind of muted color I can come up with. So I'll take some French Ultramarine as a blue, doing yellow blue, and maybe we'll add some red to that. The yellow and blue is making a green of sorts. And then I'll add, let's try the Alizarin Crimson this time. I've got a lot of red in there, so it's going to be a reddy brown. But look at that. It's a dark, rich red brown. Let's try, finally, blue and orange as another complement. So cadmium yellow again with a red to make an orange. Permanent rose. And then add some blue. We can try the cerulean. Oh, and that's different. It's kind of a gray brown. Let's see. It's like a gray-green, gray-brown color. But look at that. Already I've got a rich assemblage of brown, muted colors that I can use in creating this leaf, and just generally when I'm trying to create any nature scene that's going to have more of these subdued, muted colors in them. So let's get back to our painting. Now that we have this rich arsenal of understanding of how these colors interact, let's see what we'll use for the leaf. I'm going to be painting this in sections, all separate from each other, whereas in past I've done more wash and then work up my wash and build detail over time. This time I'll just work section by section. I think that will work well for this subject, and also just to try something new. So especially if you haven't worked this way, this may be something worth trying just to expand the types of techniques that you use in watercolor. First, let me clean off this section here with some paper towel. Try mixing some browns. I'll take a round brush and moisten that. Looking at my leaf now, let's see, we want a heavy bit of brown for down here, and then greens and sort of yellows up in this quadrant. So let me start with yellow ochre. It seems like a good base color to start with. And perhaps mix that with a darker color to beef up the intensity of this color a bit. Maybe the burnt sienna. Take a little bit of that at a time and work it in. I'm going for something that matches that color that we're seeing in this part of the leaf here. And even if it's just a base layer, that's okay. So it doesn't have to match exactly, but it's going to be our first color application. Just start putting that in. Carefully using the tip of this round brush to place that watercolor in, following the guidelines of my drawing. Take a bit of water just on the tip of my brush and then dilute some of this to continue. Being pretty careful as I do this, just to work really patiently and slowly. And some people may find it easier to use a smaller brush, such as this one, for doing this kind of work. There are definite pros to that. One of the cons is that you'll have to continue to fill that brush with pigment and water more quickly. A round brush like this can hold more water, and if you use the very tip of it, you can get that detail work in. However, you got to be really careful with the round brush because it's prone to making bigger marks as well if you press too hard. So it's a trade-off, but see what you work better with and go with that one. Later on, I'll be using a small brush a lot more, but I find I like the round brush in the beginning, especially just to fill more of the area. So working my way up, I've got some veins I've marked out for myself, and I can start to go around those. I've added a bit more water to my brush to dilute the pigment load a little bit more, and also to create some of just the natural flux in colors that we're seeing in the leaf. So it's not one uniform brown color, it's got lots of variation to it. And then I'm also being really careful to avoid painting areas that I want to keep light, such as the rim of the leaf here, where it's slightly exposing its underside to us and it's being hit by the light. All right, let me go inside this vein as well. I'm going to leave a thin sliver of white where the vein is. Take some more water, just dilute a section of this puddle here with that water. But also make sure that your brush isn't too sopping wet. We're approaching what I was calling the yellow part of the leaf, but it's okay to keep it light with the brown like this and use that as a base. The yellow and the brown are going to fade into each other anyways. It's like this. And remember that this will dry lighter than it looks right now. Conserving a vein right here. This section is dark once again, so I'll take from down here where I have a higher pigment load and start fresh in that section with darker marks. And as I'm working, this is different than other times, but I'm staring a lot more at the subject while I'm doing the watercoloring, just sort of making sure that I'm placing the watercolor roughly in the right areas and that the colors are matching what I'm seeing. It's okay to work more loosely too than I'm doing it right now, if that's your style or that's something you're interested in going for. In other episodes I've worked a lot more loosely, and this time I'm trying to be a bit more careful. The way that I work, I see the subject deserving more of that attention to detail. It's just got so much detail going on with these veins. I'm going to keep working my way up here, and as I go from brown to yellow to green, I'm going to transition as well. So you can have your yellow handy. I'm going to use yellow ochre and maybe a bit of the cadmium yellow, very dilute though, and start adding those in and mixing them with my brown mixture, and then also taking some of my hooker's green and starting to dab that in as well. What's nice about the color texture of this leaf is that it's fairly aqueous. See, there's sections of browns and greens and yellows, and they kind of bleed and flow into each other already. So you can capitalize on the watercolor medium to do that for you naturally. Take some cadmium yellow and make sure that's fairly dilute, because it's a very rich color, and I'm going to mix it in with a bit of the brown as I come into here. Take a different brush, get some of my hooker's green, and mix some of that in with the yellow as well. For that one, I'm actually going to test it because I don't want it to be too bright. It seems all right. And we'll take that, just start to intentionally let it meld with the yellow. So I'm switching between two brushes here. I've got my yellow and my green, and I will just take turns using one or the other. I really want to mute these colors and make them appear as they are in the subject, naturally sort of faded and muted. Working up the yellow this way. And then this section I skipped because I saw that there was some extra browns going on in there. So I'm taking my yellow brush, dipping it back in the brown, and coming straight for this. You can see I'm skipping the veins on purpose. I find that it helps to accentuate them. I'll mute them down later, so I'll fill some of it in, but it's just nice to have them, for now at least, sticking out, being so prominent. It helps to break up the sections of this leaf. I can start to add a couple of browns to break up my yellow where I see them. So I see browns here. And also they'll mute down the green in places, so that's helpful as well. Okay. I love how rich and aqueous this looks. We're going to work on the other side now, just continue from the top, working our way back down towards the browns. So go back for my green, mix it with a little yellow, start to go in here. Got my green brush. Just for fun, let's see what happens if we add a bit of this Indian red to the mix. So it's a very bright red, or rich brown red I should say. But if I take a tiny bit of that and add it to my brown mixture from before, it should create a richer, reddier brown like this. I'll bet I can add that in to some of these sections up here. Oh yeah, I like the look of that. I'm going to hold on that though. We'll keep that color separate. You can add that in later. Just again, trying to stay loose and playful and not feel like I'm restricted to just a few colors. There's lots of browns that we can incorporate. Continue working my way around. What's nice about this leaf is that in some ways anything goes. You can just use the leaf as a reference and get colors in there that approximate what you're seeing, but it doesn't have to be exact. So much of the beauty of this leaf is just in its imperfections and in the way that the colors just bleed one into the other. And so if you get that going in your own way, it'll be just as nice. Get my yellow. May need a bit more cadmium yellow for this. We'll do some brown as well. All right, back to greens. Get my hooker's green once again. Got a lot coming up, so I'm going to dilute that with some yellow ochre and mute it down that way, and add some of this brown mixture that we've created to subdue it. Let's test that once again. See how we're doing. More subdued than last time, which is good. And let's go for it. And I'll go ahead and put it right in where this dark shadow is. It'll create a foundation upon which to darken later. Some water. And if you accidentally obliterate some of these veins, that's okay. We're mostly just giving the insinuation that they're there. So now we're switching back into yellow territory from green, switching over to this round brush. Let's finish this up with browny yellows. Take my green brush and add in some of these blemishes with brown. I'll come back and emphasize those later, and then any other browns we want to add in. So some up along here for sure. While this is still wet. Okay, we've got some sort of a foundation upon which to build. I'm going to let this dry a little bit before I continue. So now that this is dry, I can see what the true colors look like. I've got to continue to build up my rich colors, especially in the browns that are much more intense in the photograph than they are right here. I've got to mute down some of my greens, but also boost the yellows in this quadrant up here. And then over time, I'll build up the imperfections. And of course, we've also got to tackle the stem and the shadow at the back. Let's start with the yellow perhaps. I think over here, I'm going to mix up some of this Winsor Yellow, which is a lighter, cooler yellow, as opposed to the cadmium, which is a more rich, warmer yellow. And I'll take a little bit of cadmium though to warm this up slightly. And to this I'm going to add, well, let's test it first. Let's see. So I've got this yellow. It's a bright, rich yellow, but I do need to beef up the richness of this quadrant. So that seems pretty good. Maybe a bit more of the cadmium. It looks about the same. Let's try it. The yellow is a very transparent color, so putting it over some of these parts is going to let those colors shine through still. Get some of this off my brush. I'm going to start with a lighter version of this yellow, so mostly water in my brush and some yellow pigment, and just re-wet some of these areas with my round brush. But this time I'm also going to incorporate the leaf edges, the margins that I specifically avoided before, because I want these to pick up some of the yellow as well. Being really careful. Just sort of dropping this yellow in where I see that it should go, covering some of the veins as well. Once again, working very carefully. You can see it's a pretty light coat of yellow that I'm putting down. Add some to this area as well. So I can always dull it down after with another glaze, another layer of a different color. But right now I feel like I'm missing some of that richness of these browns and greens, and the yellow is helping to give me that. It's like the kind of the warmth. That's what I'm missing. Something like that. And I can continue to drop in extra yellow where I feel like it needs. It also helps to just re-moisten some areas so that I can continue to work on them. But I'm not being too shy about where I'm placing these. Wipe off my brush. I didn't quite finish this area here before, so I'm going to do some of that now. Just re-wet some of this green that is dried. And I'm just kind of letting it go splotchy like this and playing with those imperfections that are being created. And now I'll take my brown once again. I think I'm going to beef this up with some of the Indian red that I'd previously mixed, so add that in. Take a bit more Indian red, but careful not to overpower it. We're changing the color slightly, making it a bit more red rather than brown and richer. And then I'm going to add some burnt sienna to this as well, and some French ultramarine just to darken it. I'll do that as a separate area right here, and that way I have two areas to choose from, darker and lighter. Let's test that out. Pretty dark. This will work well for some of the stem sections, and it'll dry lighter than it looks right now, so I'm going to start with that. Start putting this in, especially where there seems to be the shadow on the right side of the vein. And a diluted version of that, take a little water. Looks pretty good as well and can help as a base. Still using my round brush, but can switch to a smaller brush, another round brush, to get some of these details in. And that's a base layer. So we'll build upon that in future. Let's continue to build up color in the whole thing and slowly progress to the details, all those imperfections. Again, the focuses for today are light and shadow. I want to make sure that this appears to have some corrugation in it, so we'll make sure to put in all those shadows to make it look more 3D. Muted colors, which we have plenty of, and then imperfections, focusing on all those imperfections to bring out the detail. So I'm going to keep working section by section. Let's go for our yellows again, see where we're at. There's some areas you can see they dried already and they're maybe not as bright as I want them, so I can take more yellow and do another layer of this, and be sure to emphasize specific areas where I want brighter and more rich. Let's beef up the browns. So I had mixed this brown over here. I also want this reddier Indian red brown. Can maybe dull that down with some of this other darker brown. Something richer and more red. Put it into areas that I see are much darker. Build up intensity, build up contrast and colors, and some detail as well. I can stress some of these veins that I'm seeing. You can see how that's deepening that area so much, adding some rich contrast there. Vary the greens as well, so get more of this hooker's green. This is the very bright, intense color. I'll mix it with some cadmium yellow. It's a very bright, rich green. And a little bit of this can sort of accentuate some of the more muted greens that we have. It'd be nice to put in some areas. Very bright, so I want to make sure that it's not overpowering, but a little bit can create a contrast. We want this to be really rich and full of lots of colors and textures. And so changing up the greens like this adds to that, makes it more diverse, more interesting. Put some green in the stem here. Get rid of that white. It's still very light. Maybe now I'll go back to my browns. Some of these have dried by now, so I can create more crisp browns. I want to add another layer to this part of the stem here, and I'll just go straight with a dark color. Start adding some of these darker colors as well to the shadow areas. Now I'm just kind of working the whole piece at once, looking for where I see colors that I currently have in my palette on the leaf, and then just starting to drop some of those in. But there's just so much going on here that it can be a little overwhelming. Just take one step at a time. Where it's currently dried, while you're waiting for other areas to dry up a bit. Got this massive shadow here that I'll use a brown over for now just to help delineate it, and then over time I can try to match the color more carefully, but I want it to get very dark. That's my goal. So pretty much any dark color can do that for me right now. Here I'm omitting some of the veins, just painting in the spaces between the veins, just to give some of that texture. And I don't have to do it 100% consistently, but even just a little bit helps to convey that texture in the leaf that we're seeing. So just carefully leaving these lighter gaps. Take my French Ultramarine, darken some of this again, give another pass to this area. Just continue darkening it in layers. And for these shadows here on this green part of the leaf, they're sort of a darker version of a green, so almost a black green. So I can mix up some of my original green color with the hooker's green and then just darken that to achieve something that approximates that color that we're seeing in the leaf. So I'll take hooker's green and I can make this pretty dark and intense already. I'm going to subdue that to make it closer to the leaf green. Maybe adding some permanent rose. Let's add some French ultramarine as well. Really darken that up. Might add a bit more green so it got slightly red. We'll test that. It's like a black green. It seems pretty close for that color. Let's try it. Dilute some of that. This is a pretty strong shadow, so meaning it's going to be crisp, it's going to have crisp edges, and it's also going to be dark, contrast strongly against the other colors in the leaf. Take a little bit of water, smooth out some of these less defined edges, like over here. It seems less defined to me. And I'll repeat that in some other areas where I see a similar dark color. The more into the details I get, the longer I'm working, the drier I'm going as well. Especially as I'm doing some of these really fine, dark areas and trying to keep some of these veins going, create that veiny effect. I'm doing it every so often, not super consistently, but just trying to give the effect of those veins. Now I'm going to rely on that pencil to give a few more details in areas where I didn't do as much of the veining, and also to emphasize some of the shadows. So here's my very sharp F pencil. The idea behind the hard pencil specifically is that it can put some pressure on the paper and actually create some grooves in the paper that will influence the look of the watercolor. So you're physically texturing the paper, but it's not going to deposit too much graphite, so you're not going to get that grayish look from the pencil itself, or at least not too much of that. So I find this super useful for additional veins and micro details, especially when you're working at this scale. The larger your work, the less you need this kind of thing, but at this scale it's helpful. So I'm just sharpening some of these edges and then emphasizing shadows. And this kind of work can also be done with a fine brush, but I like using the pencil. I feel like I have a little bit more control over some areas. All right, that looks good for now. I'm pretty happy with how this is turning out. Pretty much right now what I need to continue doing is looking for more of the imperfections and trying to replicate those. So there's a lot of blemishes and small dots happening in parts of the leaf, and I can add some of those in now using a dry brush technique. So I'll take a small brush and keep very little water on the brush as I mix it with pigment so that I'm mostly creating very intense dark spots that don't spread. And then I'm going to add in my reds, and then finally I'll tackle the cast shadow at the back. So for some of these blemishes, I'm going to take my Indian red, mix up some of that color, again without very much water. So I want this to be pretty intense. And I'll just start to drop some of those in. Be careful not to make the blemishes all too consistent, especially if you're using the same brush for all of them. Try to make them different sizes so they look more organic. But these imperfections are going to make this leaf come alive even more than it already is. All right, enough imperfections for now. Let's do the red galls now. So I'm going to mix up my permanent rose for that. Do it right over here. Beautiful and strong magenta color. And this is going to contrast nicely with the other colors that I've got going on here, these greens and browns. And let's start with, so I've got my color, I've got my permanent rose. I'm going to take some of my cadmium yellow that I have in here with a clean brush and pre-moisten some of these, make it so that it's not so strong of a color. Put that down as the foundation, and also just wet some of these galls so that now I can take my permanent rose and this small brush and just start to paint this in very carefully. This part's so much fun. It creates such a, it's nice adding these contrasting colors, these complementary colors, greens and reds, to each other and seeing the effect that this makes. So I'm painting loosely around where some of the permanent rose fades and then wetting my brush, cleaning off my brush, wetting it, and then smoothing out some of these edges. And then I can even come back with, so clean off the brush and come back with more permanent rose for some areas. Let's do this one here. So for this one, minimal permanent rose on this edge in the lower left. Maybe some up here. And then I'll clean off my brush, moisten it a little bit, and start to fade what little is there into the rest so it becomes kind of orangey. I've got some browns in there too, so I can use burnt sienna or just some of the browns that I have even on my palette. While this is wet, just add a splash of that. And then this one here, same thing, kind of dropping in bits of permanent rose. I think I may start with just a wet base for this one. So wetting the whole thing lightly, and then taking this permanent rose, maybe a little more from the source, and dropping it in. Wiping off my brush, getting it lightly moistened, and then fading some of this. And let's put some dark, some brown in there, subdue that a little bit in places. So mixing up just what I have on my palette, or something like a burnt umber, just a dark brown color of sorts. And while I have that, I'll put some here too. Looks good. Just looking to see if there's anything else I'm truly missing. Maybe hide some of this white vein here with some color, just so it's not so stark white. The same with this one. And that looks good to go. So now we're going to work on the cast shadow. I'm going to switch back to a larger brush, so we'll use one of the round brushes that can load a lot of pigment and water. And I'm going to work primarily with blues, so we'll mix some up here. We'll use French Ultramarine. Definitely want to test this out beforehand. We have to subdue this, so we'll take some brown, maybe a burnt sienna. Add that in there, not too much, but enough to mute this blue so that it's not so bright. And let's test that over here. That looks like a good muted blue. And I want to make sure that this is diluted enough, so I'm adding some water to it, to this mixture. I've used up my test paper, so I will try a new one. Like that. And that's a good base of blue to start with. We don't want this to be too dark right off the bat. And simply take this and start to fill in where my shadow is. This is a pretty sharp delineated shadow, so I don't have to worry too much about keeping it faded around the edges. And I loaded a lot of watercolor into this brush, so I'm going to use my smaller brush to help push that right up into the edge of the leaf where I want it to go, and then right up to my shadow guideline where I had drawn previously, where the shadow would end. And you can see closer to the leaf edge, the shadow, if you look at the reference photo, the shadow is a little darker around there, because that's where it's meeting the leaf. Right underneath the leaf is going to be darkest. Further away from the leaf, it's going to be a little lighter. So while this is moist over here, I'm going to come back and just add a bit more color to this part, let it fade. All right, and I may have not mixed enough of this blue. I'm going to see how far I can get with what I've got, and if not, I got to mix and try to create more of that same color or something very similar. Quickly going to mix up some more of this, try to approximate that color. I just ran out. So again, that's the French Ultramarine and burnt Sienna. And see if I can put some of this in, just sort of retracing my steps and darkening as I go. And dropping in more color again towards the leaf edge, less as I move further away from that leaf edge into the shadow. Okay, and now I will let this dry completely. There we have it. Looking at it right now, there are a couple things I might add to, notably darkening some of these reds. So I'll do that really quick and that'll be my final detail. Just taking some of my permanent rose and with a small brush, adding an extra layer of darkness to some of these galls, just to boost their 3D-ness a little bit. Make them pop a bit more. Other than that, that's pretty much it. So there we go, finished oak leaf. That little oak leaf packed a lot more richness than one would expect. I find that the more I explore the microcosm around me, the more I find myself in awe and wonder at the beauty of the natural world. Even seemingly drab subjects like dried, dead leaves can be centers of color and complexity well worth a closer peek. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, becoming proficient with watercolors takes time and practice, but more importantly, it takes experimentation and fun. I hope you enjoyed studying light and shadows through your watercolor, and you feel that you've achieved a 3D effect on your paper. If not, there's no one stopping you from trying again. And how is mixing up different kinds of browns? There are tons of possible combinations to match the variety that we come across in nature, and those are anything but dull. To continue with me as I explore different subjects in watercolor inspired by the artworks from Tony Foster's Exploring Beauty journey, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. You can view all the other videos in this series on YouTube and also on the Foster's website at www.thefoster.org. Thank you for watching.